Welcome to the AACC podcast, the podcast of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. My name is Ray Chang, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. And I am so thrilled to be having this conversation with the one and only Professor Jennifer Koh.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for having me.
It's good to be together. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Well, thanks for joining us, especially because we're going to have a conversation on a really significant topic. But before we do, can you just introduce yourself? Tell us what you do. You're a law professor, but share more about that.
Yeah, so I'm a law professor at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law in Malibu, California. I teach courses at the law school in criminal law, in evidence, but my real passion and the area that I've devoted most of my career to is in immigration. And before joining the faculty at Pepperdine, I also worked at law schools where, in addition to teaching students, I represented clients and worked on cases and projects either to represent people in their deportation and detention, asylum, and other matters. Sometimes we are representing victims of domestic violence and other crime who are seeking to legalize their status, worked with community groups seeking to improve immigration policy locally, regionally, and nationally. So also my scholarship and the work that I do in terms of research focuses a lot on immigration. I see immigration very much as an issue of human rights, of social justice, but also my work in immigration grows out of who I am as a Christian. And so all of those themes are very much linked. Oh, I should also add that another thing that I do at Pepperdine is I co-direct an institute called the Newt-Bar Institute on Law, Religion, and Ethics, where we also work on a range of projects related to law, religion, and ethics.
And that's how we were able to connect. I had the privilege of being with you and speaking with some of your students.
Yes, you were a featured guest speaker.
Oh, I was featured.
Speaker series at Pepperdine Law School recently.
And it was the highlight was being with you, and of course with some of your star students. And so it was great to be together. But in addition to the work you're doing with immigration and teaching, you're also an active member of a church. You're an elder at New Song Community Church.
Right.
You want to share a little bit more about some of the other things you're doing in addition to all the things that you're doing?
Sure. And I'll probably forget some things, so apologies to folks I might have worked with. But I call New Song home.
Yeah.
New Song Church is my church where my family and I have been for over a decade. We don't actually have formal elders, but we have a board of directors, which is our governing body over the church. And so I've been a member of that board for a little over 2 years now. And I will say, so I came into New Song, it was like maybe 12 years ago when my family was moving to Orange County from the Bay Area, and I was moving to start, actually, an immigration clinical program at a small law school in Orange County. And coming to New Song, where the vision of the church is to love the misfits of the world, even in the midst of pain and discomfort, like that was a message that resonated with me. It wasn't that we were constantly preaching explicitly about social justice or necessarily talking about immigration, but in my day-to-day work, I would be working with non-citizen clients, working with immigrant communities, and the kind of just overall disposition that I felt of seeking to bring wholeness where there was brokenness, of seeking to bring resolution where the law seemed to just put up barriers. That really just I found a lot of support in the overall messaging and the heart of this church. And New Song has changed over the years. When I joined, we were in Irvine, California, very much a sort of middle to upper class suburb of Orange County. We moved to Santa Ana, which I think would not typically be characterized in that way. And Santa Ana is also home to large immigrant populations, including undocumented immigrant populations. For me and my family also, like the church choosing to move to Santa Ana and make Santa Ana home, and to be a resource to love the community from a place of humility and from a place of remembering what Jesus has done for us. like all of that has kind of sustained me over the years. There are incredible people here in this community as well who I just have so much love and respect and admiration for. So that's a little bit of my faith journey. You know, of course, as these things happen over the years, as you get more and more involved and engaged in a particular area, more opportunities or needs also come up. So around the 2017 time period, when we were in a period of pretty extensive, I think, hostility towards immigrants and a lot of threats towards immigrant families, together with other lawyers and advocates and academics in the area. I also helped start a nonprofit organization called the Orange County Justice Fund. We would raise money to allow immigrants who were in detention facilities to be freed, because there's a process by which some people who are detained by immigration authorities, not detained because they're serving a crime, but detained in jail because the immigration laws allow the government to do that under its civil authority. There are provisions that allow some people, if they're found not to be a danger to the community, not to be a flight risk, to be freed and to litigate their cases from home rather than from the inside of a jail. The problem is, in a number of those cases, people are given what's called bond, but is effectively bail. So they would need to post $5,000, $8,000, $10,000, $15,000 to be freed, money which they don't have and which they were required to post in full. So the work that we did through the Justice Fund, in addition to other things, but the bond fund was a main project, involved fundraising really to fundraise for individual people's freedom during a time period where jails were being used very heavily on people with no criminal records, on people with families, with children. You know, we saw family separation in all kinds of different ways. And so anyway, so those are some of the things that I've done. And again, I think the experience of seeing people reunited with their loved ones is a special one, of being able to see other community members come up and reach into their pockets and extend generosity and compassion. To me, all of that, again, sort of finds a lot of resonance with what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ as well.
That's so great. And it segues us into the conversation really well. We are living in some unique and tenuous times, especially when it comes to immigration. The United States just elected Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States again. And one of the major platforms that he ran on was on immigration. And at AACC, we are kind of nonpartisan, bipartisan in our approach, but we also care deeply about issues. And immigration is an issue that we definitely care about, especially because most of our communities, as Asian Americans and Asian American Christians, have recent connections to the immigrant story and to migration. I'm curious if you can kind of help us get a sense of like how you got interested in this, and then if you can kind of paint a picture of where we are in the U.S. when it comes to immigration, how we got here, and give us a sense of like what most Americans may not really be aware of, and most Asian American Christians may not be aware of, but what we should be aware of.
Okay. That's a lot of questions.
There's like
so you can
4
always
right
come
there.
back
Yes.
and like interject with more. But let me start with the first one, which is how I got interested in this area, because I think it dovetails with some of the things that the Asian American Christian Collaborative may be thinking about in terms of sort of like who your audience is, or which communities you're working with. So, for whatever reason, at a fairly early age, I was interested in this question of like, who is an American? And it probably goes back to like childhood bullying that a lot of us have experienced, relatively low grade kind of microaggression type stuff of like, being asked on the bus where you're from, or, sort of realizing I grew up in upstate New York, and The kind of ching chong slanty eyes, whole slate of things were just very common in my childhood. And probably as a result of some of that, I was just always interested in this question of like, well, really, who is American? Why does nobody know where Korea is, right? Because this was like far before BTS and any of the rise of K culture. And I think that question stayed with me, right? I actually lived in Korea in high school and attended international school. And so there too, that experience of feeling really out of place in Korea stuck with me and led me to these questions of, what does it mean to be American or Korean American? I went to law school. I was interested in the question of, in questions related to civil rights and equality. And when you look in the pages of law, if you look through the history
which I do all
of
the
legal
time. Just go
doctrine,
through
right?
legal
We just,
documents all the time.
for all the listeners who just like to do that in their spare time. So, what I found were that there were just so few Asian people in that history, right? But to the extent there were Asian names and individuals involved, they arose largely in the context of immigration law and almost exclusively in the context of the law saying to Asian people, you do not belong here. And we're going to then develop legal doctrine to support the conclusion to Chinese people, to Japanese Americans and Korean Americans, like we're going to develop the law in a manner that facilitates the conclusion that you are not and can never be American. And there were exceptions to that rule as well, right, along the way. So I was also really intrigued by that. I think that led me into immigration law. I think in addition, I had an interest in international human rights. Like just what does it mean to have limitations on how people can be treated, not because of what they've done, but because of the fact that they are human. And people who have at all had an interest in international human rights careers in the past have soon learned that there are very few jobs in the US in international human rights. But immigration law is a field that is filled with the same kinds of human rights concerns that people thinking about these issues internationally are concerned with, right? Like, what is the appropriate governmental and legal response to torture? How should people be treated? Are there limits on how you treat people? When should people be jailed, right? When should people have their freedom taken away from them? And what are the fundamental freedoms that exist for people? So all of those things brought me to immigration law. I'll try to be nonpartisan in this conversation, but I would not describe myself as someone who is neutral when it comes to where our immigration law and policy has been as a country over the years. In a lot of ways, you could say that immigration law tells us who we are as a country, right? Like our immigration policies and how we treat outsiders reveals to us a little bit of the soul, right, of America. Now, the problem is, well, that's not really a problem. I think the reality is when you look through our history, you see glimpses of beauty. You see glimpses of hope and justice and opportunities for restoration. America has been a country that has taken people in and acknowledged like the beauty that comes with being a country of diversity and many different cultures. But America has also been a country with a very ugly history, right? And an ugly history that's not at all limited to immigration. I mean, it's so very stark when you look at our own history, right, of genocide and of slavery and of Jim Crow and of all of that. So in fact, actually one of the things I do with the Law School Institute on Law and Religion and Ethics that I mentioned is we take law students to Montgomery, Alabama every year, and we have them visit sites developed by the attorney Brian Stevenson and Equal Justice Initiative that remember victims of racial lynching, African Americans who were violently lynched, sort of in the name of maintaining white supremacy. I a little bit digress. I apologize for that. But for me, a lot of where we are now, I think comes out of that history, right? We've had opportunities and we have exercised opportunities, even in recent history, as a country, to be a place of beauty and welcome and love. And we have always, as a country, also been a place that has kind of celebrated anger and hostility and has sought to define itself based on who we exclude. So in some ways, yes, our current moment feels shocking, right? It feels shocking that our leaders could be repeating such blatantly false lies. For example, the famous, dog and cat eating rumors about Haitian immigrants, which have caused concrete harm for Haitian communities. It's surprising in some ways, but in other ways it's not. It is always tempting, and it always has been tempting in times of mass economic inequality and dislocation to find a scapegoat and to be able to pin our troubles on another. And especially it's been very convenient to do so when the scapegoat lacks voting rights, is politically unpopular, and is vulnerable. So, okay, that's my attempt to answer, I think, many of your questions, but still maybe not all.
And that was great because I think you wove so many different themes in together. And I mean, I totally agree with you. It's really hard because we're in a moment where a president of the United States ran on a platform of essentially rounding up people and excluding them en masse and deporting them en masse, which we know is consistent rhetoric that has been used against Asian Americans throughout history, and has generated kind of a lot of nativist fears, throughout the history of the United States. And I agree with you. I feel like the U.S. is at its best when we take the posture of welcome, when we take the posture of embrace, when we take the posture of celebrating the uniqueness of all the different people groups. But the reoccurring and persistent and re-emerging pattern seems to be one of xenophobia, pushing people away that are looking for refuge, especially in a country that has a narrative that claims that its foundings are in allowing for people to find refuge, and not being able to kind of move out of this kind of cycle. What's unique about about immigration is that it's one that impacts so many people. Like, for example, I was talking to someone yesterday, and they said that 50% of those in Houston under the age of 18 to 20 or so are in households where their parent is an immigrant. So it's not like immigration is done for. It's not like it's gone. It's something that actually creates vibrancy. Another thing that I heard was a story of Little Village in Chicago where there was a population decline, but the inflow of 50,000 kind of Guatemalans helped to revitalize the community. Most of whom were kind of seeking a new life. When we think of immigration, we often think of narratives like they're coming to steal our jobs, that they're a drain on our economy and our society, that they're creating crime, that they're committing crimes, and that they are wreaking havoc on our communities. That seems to be very pervasive. Where is that coming from? Are those things true?
Sure.
And what are we supposed to do about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such a great set of questions. The question of where it's coming from and are they true? I think I'll start with those, right? Because Um, blaming immigrants for all of our troubles, from rising food prices to the lack of housing to rampant inequality. I mean, those are all real challenges. But when you have a national platform and you consistently send that message, there is something very appealing about it, right? The us versus them, it's their fault. And so I do think there are periods of time where you have, a handful or some number of political candidates and people who are vying for power. And it is just such an effective way to consolidate power that the message gets repeated enough times that people will believe it. The reality is this question of like, what is the economic impact of immigrants? Do immigrants cause crime more often? Like, those are questions that not so much the law professors, but like the economists and the social scientists have been studying using, rigorous analytic methods for a long time. And in particular, on the economic questions, there has not been strong consensus. There certainly has not been a conclusion that immigrants are a damage to the economy as a whole, right? There are some nuanced arguments, some of which, point to a yes, some of which point to a no, and, again, with like different impacts in different areas. And then the studies that have been done with respect to immigrant crime have effectively concluded that foreign-born individuals are no more likely to commit crime than, US-born people. The thing is, our debates are not necessarily based on reason, right? So if you take the crime angle, for example, there have been atrocious crimes committed by all kinds of people, of all kinds of backgrounds and immigration statuses. But what happens with immigration is that it takes one person who is guilty of committing an atrocious crime, whose deeds then get projected onto the entire population. I mean, it's almost like the most opposite of the gospel that we could think of, right? So to the extent that the message of the gospel is that, right, we have been effectively, our sins have been wiped clean and that Jesus has paid the price for them. This is something that is more along the lines of like your sin will always stay with you, but will also be shared with anyone else who can be similarly lumped in a vulnerable way with you. I'm not saying that there should like never be any kind of consequence for criminal activity. I'm not sort of going in that direction, but I am saying like there's sort of not, we lack reason and rationale when it comes to this conversation, right? When people start to say like, well, the studies show da-da-da-da-da, like it's very easy to tune out. But saying something like, they're going to come for you and I will stop them, that creates a different kind of mood amongst those who are listening. Do I have a solution? Not necessarily, but I do think being able to identify what is happening matters. I think valuing truth matters. Seeing historical patterns can help us be more clear-minded. When it comes to policy and what to do, here, I cannot sit here and say like, oh, let's just follow whatever the Democratic Party says. That's not necessarily a solution. But we are living in an age in which the number of people worldwide who are displaced from their homes is at an all-time high. And the reasons for that, right, so war and natural disaster and poverty are only going to probably get worse given the reality of climate change. So this question of how habitable the earth is and who gets the privilege of living in their own home is not going away anytime soon. It probably requires massive global intervention and cooperation. But what instead we see worldwide is sort of massive devolution of responsibility and retreat into building our own walls, right? America's not alone in reaching this current moment. I say that not to say like, oh, we're not alone, so we're not that bad. In fact, actually, in many ways, America remains a leader, and so other countries are following our lead. And so I do think we have, a future to contend with that poses some obstacles for us.
No, and that's so good. You literally just took me to school because
I don't know if that's a good thing.
that's a good thing because you're like, okay, you're making connections that I don't think most people are making unless they're actually paying attention. And this is what's hard is the issue of immigration is so big and it's oftentimes reduced to a soundbite that people don't know what to make of things, especially because they turn a story into the whole problem. The one bad apple turns, like really ruins the entire orchard. And the reality is, like that's not what the data is showing, and it's far more nuanced and complex. And I'm really concerned that we are losing our ability to discern through the things that need to be nuanced and the complexity that needs to be navigated. So when you think of an average kind of American, the average Christian, the average Asian American Christian, what are some things that you wish they understood about immigration and immigration policy and immigration history that they don't necessarily and might not know? And what are some things that you wish that they would kind of pursue in their process of understanding and seeking understanding?
Yeah, I mean, as tempting as it is to say, like, sit down and read these 20 books
that
and
you wrote, right?
understand,
all the ones that you wrote.
Here's a stack of articles. I think that's not realistic. So I almost want to push back on the question and say, well, the solution is not to just try to understand immigration policy, but it's almost like the solution is to reflect on who we are and who we want to be, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean we need to all come to the exact same conclusion, right? It doesn't mean we all need to say like, oh, this many visas and this kind of category and these kinds of rules, X, Y, and Z, right? And lots of people, we'll all disagree with each other. That's okay. I guess I wish we could have a baseline of commonality. And that's probably what we've lost, right? So we're no longer arguing about the details, but we've sort of fundamentally lost touch with who we want to be as a country, right? Maybe we do want to place some limits here and not there. Maybe we do want to sort of think somewhat rationally and bring immigration law in line with just core principles of what we generally associate with US law. I guess that's what I would probably ask of my fellow Christian and Asian American Christian brothers and sisters. But I would also add in, part of that thinking about who we are and who we want to be, that's very much connected with what the Bible says and what it means fundamentally to be a Christian. If we believe that we are Christians because we are sinners saved by grace, then maybe it doesn't mean that we support these really harsh and draconian policies that leave people with little hope for the future. Maybe it means that we push back on some of the excesses where cruelty and fear appear to be the purpose and the strategy for achieving policy. But you were going to say something.
No, that's so good because the who we want to be as a nation is interesting because on the one hand we're a pluralistic society, so there is no necessarily singular who, right? Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, at least for Christians and many Christians, they would like to see more of their faith somehow infused, and the values of their faith infused within the laws and the norms of our of our society. So if I were to ask you then, who should we be as a nation in light of the diversity, religious diversity, the ethnic, racial diversity, what would you say? who should we be?
Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to answer it by saying, like, you know the musical Hamilton? Alexander Hamilton and the founding fathers were flawed people, and I don't necessarily think we need to follow all their writings to a T. But, right, lots of people have seen the musical Hamilton, which sort of promises this vision of America that is fundamentally based on sort of freedom and equality. And, you know, there's that line in Hamilton where, oh gosh, I'm going to butcher it, but it's like, does this really mean freedom? Not yet. And I wish that is the essence that we could capture. And the issue of, you know, not yet, I think is also really captured in the Christian idea of like longing for a new heaven and a new earth and realizing that it is not here, but that we are building towards it and laying the groundwork. And what does that look like, right? It looks like loving God and loving your neighbor at the end of the day. Right? That's what Jesus said. Those are the two most important commandments. And so what does it mean to love your neighbor? Again, right? Practices that are designed to create fear and exact cruelty, I think are not the same as loving our neighbor. Again, we can kind of argue through some of the details of what that all looks like. You know, the last thing I'll just sort of add on to all of this, because I think it applies to Asian Americans. You know, as Asian Americans, we also live in this weird middle ground between, you know, experiencing some amount of racism without the degrees of violence and the levels of structural racism that maybe other people of color, right, don't have. But we do still live in a state of, you know, concern about hate crimes, for example, right? Concern about not being included. And I think as a result of some of that dynamic, because we are still minorities in a country with this history of like racial violence and hierarchy and whatnot, there's a degree to which we're still working on like establishing, right, that we belong. And so sometimes I think what happens within communities is that when you see other members of your same community behaving in ways that are not optimal and good, for example, being undocumented, there is a strong temptation to disassociate from them. You know, and I've sort of seen it just anecdotally in my own journeys, like there was a strong temptation to say, well, those Korean people are the problem, and we're not like them, right? And you see it in other communities as well. Well, those people are making us look bad. And so I guess that's a more unique challenge that we face where, again, I'm not saying like we all need to be best friends, but, you know, I think recognizing where that comes from, why do we have such a strong impulse to push away the members of our own community who make us look bad? And is there something that we need to kind of work through as to why we have such a temptation to go in that direction?
That's so good, and that's so helpful. So, you know, one of my friends is an international relations professor and at a Christian college, and one of the things that he said to me was, and it's kind of stuck with me, is like, yeah, I mean, there is a reason why immigration reform and comprehensive immigration reform is really hard to pass in the U.S. And a part of it is because, you know, fundamentally, it was designed to preserve and promote white supremacy, and like there is a resistance to moving away from anything that would ultimately disrupt the status quo around that. He made a very provocative statement saying that immigration laws are racist, that they are racist to their foundations because, you know, of how they were structured and set up. Is that a true statement? Is that a false statement? How would you like help us understand some of that?
I mean, I think it's hard because these days, even finding common ground on what it means to be racist, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Right? If you define racism as like I think many people define racism as like individualized animus and a desire to, right, like be prejudiced against a particular person. And so that definition doesn't apply, right? If you think of racism as more like a condition that persists, that motivates, that explains activity, if you look back through history, a lot of the harshest immigration measures arose in a context in which parts of America were very uncomfortable, maybe not so much with one minority, but very uncomfortable with the idea of large groups and large communities of, Asian people, but other groups of people as well, non-white groups of people. So it depends. Whether that's the explanation for why comprehensive immigration reform hasn't passed, I kind of feel like I would need to think a little bit more about, because I think there are more factors at work to explain why we haven't been able to achieve legislative reform, meaning typically what people mean is like a meaningful pathway to legalize those who are not currently documented, right? And the last major comprehensive immigration reform of that style happened under Reagan. But that's a whole other conversation about like political dysfunction and how a bill gets made and how political compromise works and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's helpful. I think it's good. And I think, how he would articulate it is more along the structural lines, the undercurrents, the driving forces that not so much the individual, I don't like all people that look that way, and so on and so forth. But that's really helpful. Here's another question that I have. As I think about where we are now, especially when it comes to immigration, and where we are headed with the Trump administration entering in, he's already alluded to targeting undocumented Chinese people. Tom Homan has articulated that Chicago would be ground zero and that he would want to go after Dreamers first. And one of the things that he essentially says is, both Tom Homan and President Trump have said that, that it's either going to be the undocumented person or the person that has a funny past when it comes to immigration will either have to leave or deport, or if they don't want to be separated from the families, their entire families leave with them. How are you making sense of all this? And what are we not seeing?
So I do think we're entering into an era in which deportation policy will be increasingly ugly, and to some sectors of America may be shocking, right? The idea of going after Dreamers first, for example. It's hard to know exactly what will happen. I do believe that the administration will follow through and does have a number of tools it can use. I think there are a couple of takeaways, though, that, so for example, with the targeting of Chinese students, again, whether that happens or not, or whether that was simply political posturing to appease certain audiences, that's unclear. But I think it does signal to Asian American communities that like mass deportation is not just, for example, a Latino issue, right? That is an issue that will affect Asian American communities to some degree or another. I do think we're going to be walking into a time in history where our children and grandchildren will look back and they will ask us, did that really happen? And they may ask us, like, what did you do during that time? And so that is a question that we'll all just need to answer.
That's helpful. Yeah, because a few weeks ago I was in the Senate buildings. AACC is a part of the Evangelical Immigration Table. We work with the National Immigration Forum, and so I was hosting a panel at the Russell Senate building, and then we were doing some fly-ins to talk through and talking through with some Senate offices. What was really concerning was, and we saw this in the first term as well, and these are the questions I asked, was around, the denaturalization task force and how unclear that is. And yet, President Trump in his first term commissioned a denaturalization task force where anyone that had, I mean, it literally could be anyone that had a misdotted I or miscrossed T could essentially be denaturalized and then deported to people that commit crimes, and we don't really know what the definitions or the parameters are, or people that had at one point been undocumented and then became documented. The whole stuff, everything is very fuzzy. And then the appointment of all these appointees are almost on the extreme end of immigration, and then at the same time, there are a lot of Asian American Christians that voted for Donald Trump. There are a lot of Asian American pastors that voted for Donald Trump with undocumented people in their congregations. How do you make sense of all that? And should we be concerned? Should we not be concerned?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I will say that I am in a place of really seeking to withhold personal judgment on people based on who they voted for. Like that is an inner struggle that I am currently kind of wrestling with God over. So I'm reluctant to kind of diagnose, right, necessarily, and I certainly don't want to sit in a place of judgment. But I guess I will say this, is that, to the extent that people voted, for the president-elect, even with knowledge of his overall views on immigration, I do understand where they may have felt pressed to simply cast a vote one way or another without necessarily endorsing everything that the president-elect stands for, right? And I've heard that. Yeah, I think we've all heard that, right? Like, well, I'm voting for the economy and not to condone, all of the kind of sexual abuse that's come to light, right? I'm voting for this issue, not for all the racism. That's fine, and I think the thing to keep in mind is that as we see families become separated, as we see communities impacted, as we see individual people who are in our lives faced with some really hard challenges, my hope is that even those who may have chosen this leadership will still choose to extend love and compassion and grace around them, right? That they will still choose to use their voices to speak up. I think in particular, when evangelical Christians have pushed back on the federal government's policies after being supporters, right, of the former president, now president-elect, that has had some impact, right? That has gotten heard. So, it's a question and it's a conversation, and it's not just like pastors and communities, it's within families. I think, there have certainly been all kinds of stories and experiences of people with undocumented family members who have nonetheless felt that, this candidate offered a better future for the country. I think the thing to keep in mind is that all is not lost, right? And one does not need to then capitulate to every aspect of the mass deportation agenda if you feel that it has gone too far, right? Lawyers can make a difference. Communities coming together can make a difference, right? All of the ways in which churches have always known how to kind of show, meet needs and walk into people's lives and walk with them through hardship and difficulty, and all the ways in which Christians have advocated and spoken up publicly on behalf of issues that they've cared about and demanded change from their government leaders. None of that changes. And so, I guess that is sort of in many ways, I do actually think that is maybe the last remnant of hope for what I think will unfortunately be a lot of cruelty and suffering that we will see over the next several years.
No, Jen, that was so good. I think what I really appreciate about this conversation is how it's not all one thing or another, that there's a lot of complexity to the immigration issue, that even people who are thinking about other things as more significant than this issue should still care about this issue, but they shouldn't necessarily be thrown out as, X, Y, and Z, or discarded as X, Y, and Z. So in some ways, what you're doing is helping humanize everyone in this process while still saying, don't forget those that are going to be affected by this process and whatever happens in this administration, and that regardless of who we voted for, we can still advocate for them. One of the concerns that I have, in addition to everything else that I've named, because like this is an issue that we at AACC are really like keeping an eye on and actively engaged in, is how there are moves that are being made that feel very reminiscent to the Japanese incarceration that took place, where land is being bought up in Texas and Arizona or New Mexico, where there is a spike in the stock of prison, the prison industrial complex, that a precursor to the Japanese incarceration was this rounding up, putting them into staging areas, and then putting them into internment camps or incarceration camps. Something similar sounds like it's about to take place, which is why for a lot of Asian Americans, especially Japanese Americans, when the whole conversation around families being separated was taking place and children being locked up and rounded up, they were almost on the front lines of the issue. Yeah. You mentioned something about how, if there are members within our communities that might get impacted by some of these policies or practices, where they might get rounded up, they might get deported, that we should kind of step in, that lawyers can make a difference, that community activism can make a difference, which we know that the church is one of the most powerful forces of community activism because we're gathering every single week. There are a lot of communities where these stories and the people that are going to be impacted, they're not going to be seen, even if they exist within the community. I mean, like the number of times I've been to a church where there were dreamers, but nobody knew that there were dreamers within the community until I was having conversations with them, is both startling and unsettling. Right. I am curious what you would encourage faith communities to do, regardless of whether they know. Let's actually break them down into two buckets. One is a community that has no real proximity, connection to, interaction with people that are going to be targeted for whatever in this era. And then there's another community where these people are a part of the very fabric of the community, or at least around in the surrounding area of the community. What word would you give to them in terms of how they can engage in this next season?
Maybe I have two words. Would be something like to show a persistent love, because for communities that are largely isolated for the harms that flow from immigration enforcement, sometimes you have to work at it, right? If the stories are not immediately bubbling up from your own congregation, and if everyone is just doing great and baking cookies and playing pickleball and having a great time, and I mean I say that because like I love to play pickleball, although I'm not very good. Like it takes some amount of being proactive, right, and some amount of being persistent to seek out who nearby might be affected, to see who nearby maybe has expertise, maybe who might be too overwhelmed to even know where to ask for help. And that is where I think many people have stories of churches of all colors and sizes and wealth levels kind of asking, how can I be helpful? Because I think once that question is asked, for the folks who are working on the ground and in the trenches, they will have answers, right? There will be ways to be helpful. And for the churches, but it takes like a certain amount of looking and seeing, right? In the way that like God sees the, like the woman who's just trying to reach for his cloak that no one else can see, like to have those eyes where we proactively look and see who around us might be hurting. For the churches who are just more very obviously impacted, I think it is also still a persistent love because it is exhausting when people in your community are being kind of placed in this position of need, right? It's one thing when it's one person, but if it's person after person after person and needs are bubbling up and continuously impacting others around them, right? That takes a toll on any community. And I think that's where, again, that persistence and that community building will become necessary. I don't mean to sugarcoat it. Again, I think it's going to be pretty ugly. My hope also, I think post-election, for those who are hoping for a different outcome and for those who have a sense, okay, that there could be a lot of suffering that follows in these particular ways, there's this really strong temptation for us to just bury our heads in the sand and kind of like tune out the news, not pay attention to what's going on. There's a secondary trauma that comes with bearing witness to cruelty and suffering. And I think I would say to all of us, and I'd say that even to myself as well, to try to resist that temptation. It's certainly not. I think it's not what God calls us to, and I think it's not, it's not the country in all likelihood that many people in that particular category were hoping that this could be a moment of rebuilding, but it doesn't mean that opportunity for rebuilding the country will never exist again.
So, final word, for the person that's feeling vulnerable, right? I mean, I remember talking to someone and they said that they worked at a law clinic that primarily served migrants and immigrants, and their caseload after the president was elected doubled almost immediately. Like the phone calls around what to do, how to do. Undocumented people or people that are in a vulnerable position right now. What are their rights? What should they do? What would you encourage them to do at this point?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of information out there in terms of like rights that people can be educated on and safety plans that people can develop. I guess I would say here, there's kind of a balance between panic and preparing. So I would say to prepare, right? In the way that it's kind of like, even many of us, like we put off just making a will for ourselves and then we have children and we think, even more so, I don't want to do that. But there's a level of preparation that we all want to do for whatever worst case scenario could happen. So I do feel like some level of preparation, right? Just like what should be done if ICE comes to my doorstep at 5 a.m? Who should be called? What will happen to X, Y, and Z? Consult with a lawyer to see what a person's options are, right? All of that. Anything other than just ignoring and hoping for the best. And yet at the same time, it's much easier to say not to panic, but to say that we don't know exactly what will happen, right? And to simply say, well, all is lost, that also may not be necessary in many cases, even as much as it feels, it feels like an attractive option. So, it's hard. I don't have that experience, right? I don't carry that. And so I'm doing my best. And I hope people listening will forgive me if, I've probably overlooked some really important piece of like what an individual person should do. But I do think there again, sort of like not burying one's head in the sand, being very clear-eyed, and yet at the same time caring for oneself and one's family. I think those are some things that matter.
That's good. Yeah, and if they don't know where to turn, or is there a good like one-stop shop that they can look to, or if they can't afford a lawyer, is there anywhere that you'd recommend they start looking in their community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the region that they're in. But I think any number of legal services organizations, legal aid, Catholic Legal Immigration Network, World Relief, there are a number of organizations where one can get started. And then depending on a person's situation, can either then go towards like a paid lawyer option or other resources, less or more complex cases and whatnot. So I think usually it's just like to start somewhere. And then typically within regions, the nonprofits working in immigration tend to talk to each other, hopefully, and tend to have a way of coordinating cases.
That's good. Well, Jen, this is not an easy topic, and I'm really grateful that you, as an Asian American Christian, are really thinking through this stuff and writing about it and drawing up scholarship around it and doing something about it, both locally within your local faith community, in the broader community, and then, of course, through your public scholarship. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to AACC for prioritizing this as an issue and for caring about the communities that will be affected. So I'm grateful as well.
This has been another episode of the AACC podcast with Jennifer Koh, a professor of law at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law. My name is Ray Chang, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. I'm so grateful that you tuned in. If you found anything that was shared to be helpful, make sure that you are letting others know about the work that we're doing. To follow us on social media through our social media handle at AA Christ Collab. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter if you aren't already receiving it. And then, of course, drop us a line to let us know how the work that we are doing in partnership with you is making a difference. Until next time, we'll see you later.